Lizzie.
Hello.
I'm so excited that we're getting to talk and chat. It's been a minute since we got to talk about where you're at in your new career and what you're doing with legal ops and compliance. We used to work together at Elevate, and I got to experience all your greatness then. So, of course, I wanted to reach out and talk to you about what's going on in your world now that you've changed positions. So I'm so happy you're here. Let's talk a little bit about, give me your intro and tell us a little bit about you, and then we can dive into our conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this opportunity. It's very exciting. I think it's my first ever podcast.
Oh, yay! The first one.
The first one. And we're jumping right into it with CLM. So I a giveaway. You may have noticed the accent. I'm originally from New Zealand. I went to university there, went to law school there, and started out my career practicing law at a large corporate law firm in corporate finance. And I was there for a few years, and it was really interesting work, great training and all of that. But I started to get a little bit, started to think a lot about, there's got to be better ways to do this, or, more efficient ways to do a lot of the things you can imagine a junior lawyer is doing. And so I sort of got quite interested in like the legal tech space and sort of startups and whatnot. And quite conveniently, there was a partner in the corporate legal department, and he was he was playing with like contract automation and using some of the legal tech tools. And so he actually, was able to steal me for 50% of my time. And I was working with him to almost like spin up like a legal technology startup within the firm. And so that was kind of my first like dipping my toe of not traditional legal practice.
Yeah. And
then pretty quickly after that, I started looking at sort of an exit strategy out of the firm as a whole. And that's what sort of prompted me to apply for a Fulbright scholarship and do my master's here in New York at Cornell Tech, which was Cornell University's sort of technology campus, which is on Roosevelt Island in New York. And so I did that 1 year master's, which was a master's in law, technology, and entrepreneurship. And then from there, I was kind of thinking about what was next. I knew I didn't want to go back into private practice, but wasn't really sure what the career path looked like for me, what the opportunities were. And eventually I met Liam Brown, who, as you know, is the founder of Elevate and Pratik Patel. And they were great. And they were sort of like, we want to make, a position for you here at Elevate. And they weren't really sure what that was going to look like with my background. And so I sort of, that's what led me to Elevate. And I was in the consulting group for a little bit. I was in like the digital team. So I kind of did a lot of different things. Yeah. Was exposed to a bunch of different customers and projects. And so one of my, that sort of led me to then 3 years later, what do I do next? And I kind of wanted to take those skills and apply them in-house. And so this opportunity came up at Blackstone, and that's where I am now. So growing out and leading the legal operations function at Blackstone.
So I talk to a lot of accidental legal technologists who have made this transition, and I often hear, I'm a former practicing attorney.
Yep.
And
recovering.
I hear that a lot too. Recovering. I'm a recovering paralegal. So I started out in litigation and supporting in-house corporate legal teams. So I was also like you, looking for ways to make my own life easier as a paralegal. Probably very similar work that you were doing as a junior associate. A lot of reading and a lot of research and a lot of emailing and archaic functionality, and like things would take forever. And I kept thinking there's got to be faster ways to do this, which is why I fell in love with tech too. And Elevate's sort of a great pool for that kind of talent, because there are a lot of attorneys that work there. So I wondered, like, when you told me that you were leaving for Blackstone, I was sad, obviously, because I loved working with you on our team, but I was excited for, what you were going to be able to accomplish there. And I thought, with your background in technology and the law and just consulting, this should be an easy lift for you, right? To figure out the legal ops function because you've kind of done this before. I'm air quoting.
Mm-hmm.
So when you got into the role, what were you expecting? Like, what was the charter? What were you assigned to do? And how had your training helped you? Just kind of curious about that sort of
Yeah.
background.
Well, I think to just start off, I definitely didn't necessarily think it was going to be, easy because I had, done it before. I had crazy imposter syndrome of like, am I even equipped to do this? And I actually had a really amazing conversation with Liam just as I was leaving Elevate, and he said, one piece of advice I want to give you is you're going to think that you can't do this or you're not qualified, but just know that you absolutely are.
Oh, yes.
And I think that was just like very kind, and also something that I go back to a lot when I'm thinking, what am I doing?
Right.
Should somebody else be doing this? And I think when you talk about sort of what was my charter or what was the role, I think that was part of what was kind of so exciting, but also so terrifying. There wasn't really one. And I think that I perhaps underestimated the education piece that I would need to do internally around what legal operations is and can be, because that's the beauty of when you're growing out a function that doesn't already exist. I sort of felt like there were two options. I could have gone into a really established legal department with a legal operations function and probably slotted in somewhere into a project and sort of learned a lot, worked my way up that way. But, here I just had a complete blank canvas to forge a strategy and what, figure out what we had going on. And it was so exciting that both our COO and my direct supervisor knew that this was something that we needed, and we had full buy-in from the department. They just weren't necessarily sure what that looked like or where to start. And I think initially, coming from that consulting background, you are very much taught, best practice and like the clock wheel, right? Like these are the 12 areas that we should be looking at, and let's prioritize into a matrix. And the reality of when you go in-house is that, there are things on fire, and there are like business objectives and strategies that you have to be mindful of and kind of fold into that and adapt to that business setting, and maybe leave your ego at the door a little bit and think like, well, that's not really what legal ops is. But, it could be as simple as saying like, we have the Microsoft Office suite. Like you could use lists to do this, or store documents in repositories and things that, build trust and sort of gain visibility across the department as well before you do the bigger stuff, And so that was a journey that I went on, maybe naively expecting that there would be these are the things we want you to do, or this is what the role is. Exactly. and knowing like that doesn't really exist. And so it's more conversations you learn in those first few months of where, of this whole universe of things we could do, where should we start, and what's going to have the biggest impact versus, what's long-term, short-term, all of that. And also, I think something that's interesting coming into a new function, everything that technically falls within legal ops in the way that we think about it in the clock wheel was sort of already being done by somebody else in the organization.
Right.
And so having a lot of conversations around, look, I know that you're doing this and you've been doing, maybe a great job, but I want you to be doing the highest and best value work for you. And so maybe that's something I can help you with or take off your plate or create some structure around. And so there's a lot of conversations around like messaging of, where you can take things on. And that was a learning journey as well of being like, well, I just thought I would do all of that. Everyone should know that's what legal operations is. But it's a slower burn to kind of get your work streams set up and then slowly dip a toe, and then people earn your trust, and then they'll give you more projects. And quite quickly you are overwhelmed with lots of different projects, and you're having to think about how you'll action everything. But so that was that was a little bit all over the place, but some of the things that I found when entering.
It totally made sense to me. I was just thinking, like, so you come in and you have, this preconceived notion of sort of what legal ops is. And then you have your background, you're kind of layering it all in there. And then you're talking to the organization to figure out how they're functioning. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of like the first 3 months, maybe you're just kind of trying to figure
6.
6. Okay. 6. That's better. You're trying to figure it out, right? You're trying to figure out how things are operating currently, where the gaps are. I think that consulting background probably helped there, right? Because we're used to doing that when we go into an organization for like legal transformation and process redesign. Like, let's figure out what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And where the pain points are and where things are broken and how we can help, which is, what you were saying. And then what? Right? Then you start the lists, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah. And I think you touched on a really great point of, when you go to law school, you're trained to think a certain way, right? Like to apply some kind of structure to a problem and, obviously apply the law, but, a way to think. And then when you're consulting, you learn kind of a different way to think. And the two work quite well together. But I think that's a really good point of I naturally was wanting to create structure around various things that were happening, right? And a lot of the value that I didn't even realize I could have was just around like seeing things from that perspective of, okay, well, what's current state and where's the pain and what do we want it to look like? Right. And what's the delta? Like how do we get there? And then little things like project management. It's a funny thing that you don't learn that in law school, and maybe they do now, but some of these like large litigation matters or transactions, they're huge projects, and yet we don't think about them in the way of like, okay, what are the discrete tasks? And that comes into all sorts of things like the budgeting of it and the resourcing. And so even just being there to talk to some of the attorneys or some of the people in our group of, well, let's think about it like this and break it down. And where can we use templates or, create some structure? And I think those are the small, quick wins that I didn't necessarily consider before starting the role, but super important in laying the foundation for, I think, which is your question, right? Of like, then what?
Then what? Yeah.
And so the then what was sitting down with our leadership and like our COO and understanding, what are the business objectives? What are the department objectives? Where do I, from my perspective, what have I observed? And always kind of coming to conversations with a point of view of like, this is what I'm seeing. This is probably what I would do. And then giving them something to react to. Yeah. And, that makes it so much easier for people to give feedback as well, especially lawyers, to sort of pick holes or change priorities. Yes. And so from there kind of found there are a number of buckets that we wanted to look at. As I say, there's always things on fire. Yes. And I think, not dissimilar to most legal departments, document management and contract lifecycle management, not that they knew that it was that at this point, seemed, just really obvious. And it was something that has been talked about for many years across the group. When you're dealing with lawyers that have come from law firms, they have a very high standard of, well, we all used iManage or NetDocs or like some sort of document management system at their firm, and then you come to an in-house department. Yeah. That's maybe grown very quickly. And so things have been very reactive, and the systems or processes haven't necessarily been put in place. And so that was what I really was very obvious was we need to just wrap our arms around what knowledge we have. Where does it exist? How do we leverage it so that we're able to, quickly search for things, dive into precedents, like what we've agreed to, all of that sort of thing. Yes. And so that's kind of what led us to the beginning of this CLM journey, which really is a journey.
It is a journey. Yes. And so, kind of pivoting there, I'm imagining that once you've established the pain points and sort of the buckets, right? A lot of that is addressed with technology, which, CLM is one of those components. And so, I love that you sort of tapped your network of people. You and I have had a lot of conversations about it. I know there's other folks in the industry that you've talked to, like what are their opinions about the tools in the marketplace and where to start and how to get ready. So when you focused on sort of the CLM component as one of the buckets, what did you do after you reached out to different folks to get opinion? How did you sort of define what you were looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say, and this is where the imposter syndrome came back, reared its head, was sort of, I've worked in and around CLM for years, but I've never been the one purchasing it and
Mm-hmm.
actually having to make the decision and mapping it all out, sort of start to finish, and have people, asking me my opinion. And at the end of the day, the buck kind of stops with me of if it fails, rather
Yeah.
than when you're a consultant, you can kind of come in, you can say, oh, it was the client, that didn't have things and didn't maybe have everything in place.
Right.
So I definitely felt a little bit of stress. And so part of speaking with, you was so helpful in this process, as well as, other folks. And that's the other thing about like the legal ops community, right? It's just such a community,
Yes.
being able to, talk to people, your peers at other similar organizations or other people in your role. And we're all going through the same stuff. And the
Yeah.
other thing is, like, this industry is still pretty new. And so a lot of the time there isn't necessarily roadmaps and guidelines on how to do it. And so we're all
Yeah.
kind of navigating it at the same time. And so that was really helpful to understand how other people have tackled this. And
Yeah.
then I was able to sort of overlay it with our own nuances of our department. And so, yeah, really it was just getting an understanding of current state, I think was a big one for us. Knowing how to go about like stakeholder interviews, understanding who the right people were that we needed to talk to, get in the room. And that was like a growing list, right? Every person you spoke to
Yes.
was like, oh, you should speak to so-and-so in procurement, or like
Right.
so-and-so in finance, or you learn that maybe like someone looked into this 4 years ago and it didn't work and it will never work. And, you're dealing with all of those kind of opinions and the history there. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you think is going to be the challenge of maybe selection and implementation, you realize you've got to do quite a lot of groundwork before you
Yeah.
even get there. So that was very interesting.
The groundwork is important. And in the consulting space, I've done that a lot of times where you walk into a customer to sort of get the state of the union, I like to call it, about what's really happening and who's involved. And funnily enough, if I'm like scoping an engagement when we're going to do stakeholder interviews, I always know there's going to be probably 10 to 15 more than I think there's going to be, because everyone does have an opinion, because everybody touches contracting, right? So it always takes a little bit longer to gather that data. And it makes me think, I just saw a post by Olga Mack, who, she's a really strong voice in LinkedIn in this space. And she said, I love long beginnings. And it was something to, it's a perspective shift for me, because everyone's always trying to get to the implementation goal, the end, so that, the magic button can be pushed and our worlds are wonderful because they're digitized. But the importance is in the prep, right? Taking that long amount of time to understand, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, you and I obviously know this better than most, but we're always saying like it's the people, process, and then the tech,
Right.
comes to kind of what was that analogy that Stephen Allen used to talk about? But was like, if you think about it in terms of a car, like you need the wheels are the people, or the body is the process, and then the turbo is kind of the tech. That's what takes it to the next level.
Right.
And if you don't have those things, the right people and doing the right things, if you don't have the right precedents, if you don't have, all of these little pieces that are so critical before you even get to digitizing anything.
Right.
And that's exactly where people get frustrated, right? They're like, oh, but can't you just like put it all into the system? And then when they realize what the lift is internally as well with resources, that's where things kind of fall flat. And so that's another thing that I was very cautious about was, taking also the other thing, right, is like looking at this in phases. Let's just start with one group, like one
Yes.
work
Very
stream,
important.
and break that down, figure out, who are the champions, who's really eager to get on a system and iterate and kind of figure it out, but also who kind of has their stuff together, who's got a playbook maybe, or who has really great precedents. And so finding that kind of user group to start with, that was super valuable. And luckily I found that person pretty early on, and she's a big fan of legal tech, and her team is the one that is, leading the charge in terms of centralization of how we do our contracting and all sorts of things. So it was really a perfect recipe there. And then, they will be the champions as we sort of roll this out more broadly. And so I'm hoping that's how it's all going to go.
I find that it usually does. And then, you and I have talked a little bit about change management, as it's not always, that's not the back end work. Change management starts really early on, right? With finding champions that are going to evangelize throughout the organization, and they're going to talk about it, and they're going to say, wait until you see the cool things that are coming. So if you can find those people in your organization, like latch onto them early, I'm glad you did, because it's so important. They're going to help you navigate the rest of the organization and be kind of the guinea pigs. If they're excited, they're a little bit more tolerant.
Exactly, right? I think that some people think that, we want to start where like the biggest pain is, or like the biggest impact could be. And I think, sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes it's actually easier to start with just people that are willing to explore, like go on this adventure with you, right? Giving up, because it's a lot of time. You need people to be invested. It's not necessarily something you can dip in and out of, and having those conversations of look, this isn't going to be perfect right away, but then also the messaging of, but you're so lucky if you're the first person, you get a chance to mold what it might look like, and so people always like that as well. But I think I underestimated how interested people are in legal tech. Like we definitely have a great sort of entrepreneurial and like innovative mindset at Blackstone, which is fantastic. And so haven't met too much resistance yet.
That's wonderful.
We'll see as we go through the different phases. But
I wonder, as you're on this journey, were you kind of said you're starting from scratch, so to speak. There wasn't really a charter. When you're looking at other technology, are you just focusing on CLM for your teams because that made sense first? Or do you have to sort of connect other tools in this role too? Do you have to look at other types of technology besides CLM?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of considerations. And again, something that I didn't really know so much about before starting a role like this. And so I think you always need to be turning your mind to integrating with enterprise-wide solutions, understanding how other departments leverage technology, what technology they're using.
Yes.
Because you're always going to be asked the question, why would we buy a specific technology for legal when we already have, as I said, like the Office suite, or, we might have like a Salesforce or different types of technologies that can kind of do similar things. And so there's a lot of internal sales of why specifically you need this. And it also goes to, what type of CLM you might end up choosing, right? Like what can integrate with what you already have. You might need something, slightly more flexible. And I think that's been a real learning curve. And another consideration of making sure you have the right people in the room. So we're really lucky to work very closely with our IT department, but they can connect the dots with like more broadly IT, and then understanding across the different business groups. We might have 3 different technologies that basically do the same thing. And so that's where you quickly see the role augmenting and trying to understand, okay, maybe we need to sort of take stock of all of the different tech that we have. And how we're using it. Should we be using it for this, or could we consolidate? And also some people don't know necessarily some of the tech that you do have. And so advertising that a little bit and saying like, we do have these things that can solve some of your needs. It's also an interesting role just from the perspective of now there's a single point where people know to come to with their kind of requests or queries. And so it gives that holistic view of people's needs,
Right.
Technology related, but also our, process sometimes. And so you're able to connect those dots as that single point of contact, where I think it may be more sort of siloed or segmented if you don't have that like central point of contact.
And a lot of organizations, I think, are siloed. It's just sort of, especially when you're working with a company that's had a lot of high growth, because they're just trying to focus on getting their job done, right? And so there's not time to kind of look up and see what everyone else is doing or how they're handling things. So you find a lot of redundant activities or, 6 spreadsheets here and 4 here. And you find sort of all these little broken pieces that don't necessarily feel broken. But once you kind of lift up and look at the landscape, you're like, oh, it starts to make sense, right? You start to think like, if we had that automated report, for example, pulling out of CLM, like it could feed all these different areas of the organization. Yeah. So it's almost like you get these little clues and you're sort of, it's a mystery you're solving, right?
Yeah, basically it's, you need to be careful of saying like, where is the pain? Because sometimes people think that they have a great system. It's like, we have this tracker manually in Excel and like, then I email 20 distribution lists. So like, sometimes people don't even know the art of the possible, right? Like they don't know, you can't just say like, what do you want? Because sometimes people don't know what exists. And so you have to be very careful about how you're wording those conversations. And it's more about like, just like, tell me about your day. Like, what are you doing? Like, what tasks are you doing? And that's when you begin to uncover, oh, okay, so you're updating like 7 different spreadsheets and trackers, and then so someone else over here is doing the same thing with different trackers, and it's the same data, but slightly different. And it's not, as you say, like as businesses grow really quickly or scale, it's not a bad thing that they've done it this way because it's got them to where they are, right? But sometimes, of course, if you think with retrospect, you would have set up the systems like the foundation and then they would have scaled with the company. But when you're having to sort of retrospectively do that and deal with these cobbled together systems, you have to get a little bit creative about how you do that, and also be really sensitive to people with like, you have done a great job with what you had and at that time, and we're going to build on that, or we'd love to leverage that, or take that off your plate, or make it easier for you. And so it's a lot around the messaging, I think.
I think so too. It's you don't realize that you're walking into the role of a diplomat, but that is really the role, right? It's very
and
diplomatic.
A therapist,
and a therapist. Yes. There have been many of those sort of therapy sessions in my career, so I fully relate. And then I also think that you have to be careful because there can be defensiveness, which is not the intention when you start to ask questions about process. People can tend to be like, worried and defensive, like, why are you asking me this? Is it going to take away my job security? And I always like to say, no, it's going to allow you to sort of scale to the next level, because we're getting rid of all this 7 spreadsheet data entry that you've been holding on to, So have you felt, have you sort of had to tap dance around that defensiveness, or just think about that in the conversations you're having so that it doesn't go there?
Oh, definitely. And you never know what way these conversations are going to go, right? Like some people just like welcome you with open arms. I definitely felt that as a consultant a lot, like when you're coming in externally, I think people really get get very nervous about why is somebody coming in to look at what we're doing or asking me about my work, which is so natural, right? Like that's
of course,
a natural reaction. I also found, maybe this is slightly tangential, but sometimes if somebody very senior has arranged this engagement, right, like arranged for a consultant to come in, sometimes if the messaging hasn't been right internally, and you think you're like ready to step in and be like, everyone's going to be on board with me being here for change and all of this, and you realize like, oh, this didn't really trickle down in the way that it should have. And so never expect that the messaging or the change management has been done internally,
Right.
there's always room to, set the scene, set the stage, share about like the broader vision, and that you're there to help and partner with them. I think always goes a really long way. And as I say, like saying, you've done a great job to get there. Like, how can I help? How can we make this even, more efficient, or take this off your plate if it's something that, isn't really. I always think about, like, what did you go to law school for? Or like, what excites you about this job or your role? Because it's probably not manual data entry into
I was going to
Excel.
say, it is not the spreadsheets, even though, I mean, I have taken some great pride and pleasure in some beautiful spreadsheets in my lifetime. So I understand
and
100%.
Project plans and, yeah.
Like, I've dedicated some serious time to these macros and these pivots. Like, I 100% get it. So there is the ownership there, and there's the pride, and like, I recognize that we needed this thing. This was the tool I had, and it's what I used, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Now let's build on that, right? So,
The other thing that I think has been quite challenging is the desire to have a more efficient process or to digitize something, but recognizing that if you do that, you lose some element of maybe control or, review or touch on that process.
Right.
And that compromise, whether it's, you need to look to the right processes that you want to be automating or outsource, or like doing anything in terms of, are we outsourcing it? Are we, when you're looking at a process and maybe how you can do it in a different way. And that's something, especially with like really top tier organizations that really value perfection and, being industry leading, sometimes relinquishing that level of control or that high touch level of review is tricky, because as you grow, as you scale, you need to, because you simply can't hire just hundreds of more bodies, especially, in the market today. And so looking at being very deliberate about, well, what are those maybe low risk, low value tasks that we can digitize, automate, outsource, whatever it might be, and seeing what people are comfortable with.
Right.
So that was something I hadn't necessarily expected.
Taking that point into sort of the CLM world, when you're looking at, you mentioned this before, but looking at like, where do we start? Sometimes the recommendation that I give is who's ready, like you said, who are the evangelists? Oftentimes it's what can be self-serve. We're comfortable with that. So it's assessing that threshold, right? And then, for you all, where was the first place you started once you kind of got the lay of the land? Was it getting that buy-in or that team to say, we're going to start with you? Or was it, once you kind of got the lay of the land, what was like the next step you needed to do to figure out how to get ready for CLM?
Yeah, it's so true. And I think part of maybe wearing the consultant best practice hat of, I wanted to do that matrix of like, okay, what is the world of our contracting? And you also need to think about the business, and because some companies, right, they're like selling widgets, and so their contracting needs are very different to, like a financial institution where it's more about large transactions and deals where you use outside counsel a lot. And so that life cycle piece isn't as common. It's more about how you leverage the information in the documents, and use that to sort of have reporting, forecasting trends, and give advice to the business unit on a reactive basis. So you look at the sort of contracting that you are doing, repetitive, maybe sort of lower risk, like your vendor agreements, your NDAs, that kind of thing. And so that seems to be like, that might be the starting point. And conveniently for us, there was a move sort of centralizing a lot of those types of agreements and that contracting. And so luckily that person that was leading that charge was also the real evangelist around legal tech and CLM. And so the two kind of married up.
Yeah, that was
in our
lucky.
situation, which was very lucky.
Yeah.
And yeah, so sometimes it does work out that way. And sometimes you have to think about, okay, you know, these people are just really eager to get their documents into a system. Maybe that means it's not whole life cycle, but it's just like leveraging the repository,
Yeah.
and you can maybe do dual tracks.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So pivoting to, so you all, I know this because we've had lots of conversations about it. When you're looking at CLM tech, because you're coming into the role trying to find the tech to meet the need, right? And so I always say, there's so many great CLM tools out there. It can be confusing to know which one's right for you. And so in order to kind of figure that out, you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to talk to a lot of vendors. You have to kiss a lot of frogs, I like to say. You have to do all the things, right? And so I always like to say that it's, there's a tool out there for everybody, and it's dependent on how much you want that tool to do, and then what the other tech is that you're working through, and sort of the appetite of the company. So when you are thinking about your like top 3 things that are important for the CLM tool you're looking for, have you bucketed those yet? Like, what are the top 3 things we need? Is it has to have a great repository, or it has to do this? Like, were you able to narrow that functionality yet? Yes. Or you're still in that process?
We're sort of still in the process, but, you know, we have a pretty good understanding now. And I think, to your point, there's so many options. Like, it's overwhelming, right? You Google it, you look at the Gartner reports, you speak to people in the industry, you go to conferences, and there's just so many options, and they all seem really great, and you love them all in the moment, and you're like, that's the one. And then you know, exactly. It can be really overwhelming. Yeah. And so sometimes it's helpful to kind of ground back into your requirements, right? Yes. Like, what really are your business users' needs? Yes. And we documented all of that, right? Like, we have a multiple tab spreadsheet with all of our sort of, you know, very specific business requirements. Like, we need this kind of, we need to be able to save it or have the permission things in this way. And then there's technical requirements. But at the heart of it, I think what we were thinking about was a great repository, right? Because as I said, like, our contracting needs are kind of different. A lot of it is not actually getting the contract executed and negotiated through the tool. It's being able to, once it is by maybe outside counsel, ingest that data and be able to quickly access what's in them, right? Like, across all of our agreements, can we quickly pull out clauses? What have we agreed to? Look at like trends in how we're contracting. That sort of thing was really important to our users. The other thing was, is this a tool that's flexible enough? As you said, like, can this integrate with all of the different technologies that we have across the organization? Is it something that's forward-looking in terms of technology? Does it sort of see what's coming around the corner? You know, we all are talking about ChatGPT. Are they thinking about that sort of thing? Right. Is this, you know, so flexible in that way? But also that's going to be able to grow with us. And we really like the idea of having a partner that we can see the vision of their tool and their product, as well as our relationship with them. And so that was also really attractive. But I'm sure if you ask like every different user or like stakeholder that we're talking to, they have a different opinion. Right. Yeah. Right.
And so that sort of heads me in the next direction that I was thinking of as you were talking, is you start out with the funnel, right? You're at the top of the funnel and you're figuring out all the things, and you're looking at the use cases and you're figuring out what the top priorities are, and you get that layer established. And then I think it goes back to, again, what's the then what? Because for me, I always think about, now that I know these things, now I'm going to start taking this data out into the market and looking at the tools. And then what did you do to sort of get feedback loops with your organization? Like, how did you organize that process?
Yeah, good question. I think we're really fortunate to work so closely across departments. So like with procurement, with our IT department, and they really helped us shape that process. So just even documenting requirements and
Yeah.
then having the right people on the calls with the providers. Because honestly, I saw so many demos, like tens of demos.
Yeah.
And you almost want to be like, stop. Like, I know what CLM is.
Right.
Like, I know the table stake stuff. I just almost want you to tell me why you're different from the one that I talked to yesterday. You know, you just become quite,
numb to it, right? Almost
quite numb to it. Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've got to a point with this technology where they're all probably great and they would all work. So then it's you're dealing in minutia of like what's slightly better for us, or our users might just never want to leave their environment that they're used to working in. So like what's the least intrusive into the way that they operate? Mm-hmm. And so little things like that, you start to sort of move the needle.
Yeah.
And that's where I think grounding and like some of your requirements you've got from those users you can point sort of to the data rather than feeling overwhelmed by, they all are pretty much, could do this job. And it becomes easier to think about it, and getting those different perspectives as well, like getting your tech team involved early to ask the questions of, well, wait, would this even integrate with our systems? And we have this, like, maybe it's something that you've built internally that isn't,
homegrown
homegrown tech that you have to integrate with. And,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just questions that I don't necessarily know to ask.
Right.
And so making sure that team that you're working with are the right people, and they can kind of see the blind spots that maybe you're not aware of.
That's a great point. And I think you and I have talked about this also, is sort of scoring. And it's using data first, and then sort of like
scorecard.
The scorecard, and then the emotional response secondary, I think. And that's to the people, to the visual display of the tool. But I think first of all, taking the vendor scorecard and saying, yes, it did this. Yes, it did this. So I'm just curious if you feel like sharing, what were some of the questions that you asked in your vendor scorecard? Was it, do you like the UX? Was it like, what were some of the areas you focused on?
We're not quite there yet, but we're going, this is also goes to, I think, having different buckets of users almost. So
yes.
We have the core you'd have your core group of really invested in it. So like the me's of the world, the IT department, and we might have a spreadsheet list, right, of like tick boxes, and you're not only, do they have this, but what's the weighting of that priority for us? So having that kind of really extensive spreadsheet. And then for your users, they're just looking at what's relevant to them, right? So how does this make their life easier?
Mm-hmm.
And so being very clear with like what each of those group of personas looks like.
Yeah.
So are you just a requester? Are you just a reviewer? And so making sure that also that the vendor is prepared for who they're who they're presenting to, and then having different groups of demos potentially, and then the scorecard that you're giving the users, wanting their feedback. You need to be very thoughtful about the questions you want to ask them, because, you wouldn't say, does this have the right integration with so-and-so? Because they'd be like,
the sales team's going to say, I have no idea.
Maybe, I don't know. You really want to hear from them, like, is this something that you would use?
Yes.
Or what was, you want to have to the data point, you want to have an element of like quantitative data points versus some qualitative feedback. And so understanding like, is this something that you could use? Or like, what is your favorite function? Is this functionality you think is missing? Those sorts of things. And then of course, like gut feel, like, did you like the UI? Because that's really important. If they hate the color, I don't know, magenta, and that's what the whole UI is, then
like,
maybe
this isn't
exactly.
And I think something that I was thinking while you were speaking that I love about what you've done is being open to the vendors you're talking to, because I think that only helps, and I'll explain why. Like when I go into an RFP process and it's a blind questionnaire, I cringe because I just know that they're not going to get the level of interaction or detail that they need. in, juxtaposition to the process you're taking, where you're actually talking to the vendor and prepping them for who they're going to talk to, because that's a more successful demo. And I know from working with many of the vendors and their sales teams, like that is the best possible scenario for them, because then they can show you how they differentiate. Right. So I think that I wanted to stress this, because I love that you've done it, where you've just been really open with the vendors to say, here's what I need. Here's who you're going to talk to today. And here's what they're going to think is important. Like, I don't think enough companies do that. And I just wanted to call that out, because I felt like it was really important to the process for you.
Yeah, I will say there's different perspectives to it. I think maybe on the technical side, they're more about, just give the list of requirements, tick, and it's more about that, like, you either do or you don't have this functionality. Whereas when you're dealing with especially like legal and compliance departments, or maybe less technical people, it's not just about the functionality. That's almost like assumed, you would hope, that we've vetted that out. And so you want to get a good feel, for what they need, and then share that with the vendor, so that it's a change management on both sides, right? Like you want the demo to speak to them, so they're more bought in on the vision of CLM as a whole.
Right.
So I really do think that like dialogue, that conversation, that transparency around who they're going to be speaking to and what's important to them is really critical.
I think it's so critical. I can't even talk about it enough, because I feel like when you come into it blind, you're cutting yourself off from so much valuable information on both sides to buy in, just like you said, because in an RFP or in a technical response question, the answer is always going to be yes. But the important answer is how, right? Yep. So you want to see how it's going to impact your users. And the only way to prepare a vendor for that is to talk about it with them.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm excited for your journey. It's been fun watching from afar, and I know you're sort of in the middle of it, and you've got a long runway ahead. And I'm excited to watch you guys do it. I wondered if you could share, from your legal ops perspective, what are 3 really important things that maybe our listeners could take away to stand up a role like this? What are some really, maybe if you could think of 3 things that you would tell yourself coming into this role, like, here's what you need to think about, and here's what you need to think about. I think we've talked about it, through the podcast, but if we could summarize,
distilling it down to 3.
Yeah. I think from what I've heard, I think it is, be open-minded, but come with a perspective. Are there any other key takeaways you would tell younger Lizzie that walked into this role a little while ago?
I think really get to know the business, right? And the objectives, strategic objectives of the business and of the department, because that's what's going to guide your priorities and how you go about it. And I think really checking any ego at the door. I think having confidence in your ability is super important. And that's something I have to keep coming back to, of trusting my experience and my gut, because you have been hired for a reason, right? For your experience and perspective. But at the same time, not coming in necessarily with the mandate of how you think everything should work, because in the environment that you're about to enter, there will be history and there will be different priorities and all sorts of things. So almost like checking the ego at the door, as you say, being open-minded to where that might take you, and allowing yourself some time to figure it out. It's not going to happen day one. You're not going to create like a roadmap for the next 3 years and that's that. You have to be really adaptable to that.
And having some realistic expectations for that very thing. You won't have a charter in the first 90 days. Like, that's not, it's going to take you longer than that. Right. And just saying that's okay.
And saying that's okay. And doubling any time frame that you initially had for anything.
Double.
Because it all takes time, and never underestimate change management.
Yes,
ever,
so important.
It's critical. Yeah, talking to people,
all of those things, listening.
Yeah.
I think listening is
helping them along the way, because that's what we're there to do.
Right. I think that's so important. And then taking that, do you think the same thing applies, like, just to stand up the legal ops function in an organization? You need all those things that you just mentioned. And I think the same are true for CLM, but is there any like takeaways that you would tell people you really have to do this when you're looking at a tool, or don't forget this? Like, are there 3 top of mind things, just because I like threes, that you can think about? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. The same things can definitely apply. I would also add just like making sure that you have the right team. So you've got the right people in the room, whether that's your IT department, procurement, finance, HR, whoever that might be, really ticking off that you've got the right people. And I think that plays into change management.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't care as much or don't want to be involved, but at least you've reached out and involved them in the conversation and paying heed to maybe what's been done before and learning from that rather than, forcing something, saying, look, I understand this has been, you've tried this, maybe this is where it fell short, or just like asking a lot of questions. So the listening comes up a lot there. Finding your champions, finding the people that are excited about change, about technology, and they're willing to work with you. Because if you're like me and you're the first hire in this function, you don't have a team. And so they become sort of your proxy team, your support system internally.
Yeah.
So I think that's really critical. And then, using your network, if you don't have that team internally, looking across the organization for other roles or, beyond, looking at other people that have been through this journey or are going through this journey, vendors, colleagues. Yeah. It's a great community, and there's so much knowledge out there to tap into, but at the same time, not getting too overwhelmed by it and trusting in yourself and your own judgment that you can listen to everybody's advice, but at the end of the day, like, trust that gut that your situation the best, and being okay to maybe taking the advice but doing something different. I think that's also super important.
Yeah. Lizzie, I'm so excited that we get to talk about this today. There's so many great points. You're just in the thick of it, right? And I just know really in the thick of it. And you have a lot of decisions to make ahead and a lot of work to do. And I'm excited to watch you do it. So thank you for spending time with us today. This was really fun. I know a lot of our listeners in the similar space are going to find value in this. So thanks so much for spending time with us today.